What I've given you here along the side here with the one, the forms of the one, the demiurge beings, and art wrought by beings. This is the way I'm going to talk a little bit about the mimesis bit in the Republic, and then also what goes on in the Timaeus, to give you a little bit of both. So one of the things you'll notice is that there is this concern in the Republic about imitation. That if you make something in a bid to resemble something else, that there will be a gap between the thing you made and the thing that you made it in the image of, right? So if you think about what's a good table, and then you make a table, your table will not be perfect. There will be some gap between the table you make and the good table, right? You need a notion of the good table to make a decent table. If you don't have a notion of the good table, where are you to begin, right? But you aren't actually going to be able to make a perfect table. Your table will have some flaws in it because everything that comes into being is flawed for Plato, and everything that comes into being must decay. This is the sense in which for Plato, the good or the forms are higher than what comes into being and are more real than what has being, right? What has being is deviant from the one or the form of it. Now, that doesn't make it bad. It just makes it less good. And for Plato, the good is the thing that is the most real. And anything that is less good is less real. Because what's real and what comes into being are two separate questions for Plato. Right? Part of the deal with Socrates is that he's so good that it's difficult for him to exist. It's difficult for him to have being and to sustain being across time. For Socrates to have continued to live, he would have had to sneak away from the sentence that he was given, or he would have had to talk differently to avoid being sentenced, or he would have had to make a different argument for himself when he was being tried. And each of these things would have required him to be a worse person in various ways, from Plato's point of view, so that he could survive. What we have to do to survive, necessity for Plato often conflicts with what's good. And so we make these concessions to necessity, and these concessions to necessity force us to accept flaws, which then tend to grow over time and to become bigger problems at later points. One of the things he talks about in the Republic is the distinction between the necessary and the unnecessary desires. The necessary desires are those that most people cannot get rid of, even when they're educated and trained. And the unnecessary are those that you can actually train people to not focus so much on or pay so much attention to. Now, this distinction, he never says exactly which desires fit into which in the Republic. Arguably, in the laws, he does. In the laws, he lays out very, very cleanly a set of rules and about what you should allow and what you shouldn't allow. In the Republic, he only briefly brushes up against this occasionally with things like poetry, where he tries to spell out what kinds of poetry should be accepted or not accepted, whether poetry in general is okay. And part of the emphasis here is that poetry is very beautiful, it's very attractive, and yet this might be precisely what's dangerous about it. The things that are beautiful about it might cause it to not be good. Is there a gap between the good and the beautiful? This is part of what's being wrestled with in relation to poetry. Are the good and the beautiful the same, or is there a difference? So, in the Timaeus, Plato gives a cosmological account. He gives an account of how the universe was made. And this account has been enormously influential on all of the major Western religions, all of the Judaism, Islam, Christianity. Judaism is older than Platonism, but a lot of the Jewish texts are written down and formalized during the period of the Maccabean revolt, when Israel was occupied by the Macedonians. And there was a conflict between Israel and the Macedonians, and a significant part of the Jewish population became Hellenized, adopted Greek ways of living and thinking. And there was a transmission of Greek ideas into Judaism and a certain amount of intermingling that went on. And of course, after this point, what is considered Judaism is still treated as distinct from the Greek, but also there has been an interaction. And as a consequence of this interaction, you'll sometimes see people who want to take it the other direction and want to claim that actually Plato was giving a Jewish view, that Plato had somehow been influenced by Judaism prior to writing his text. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, given the point at which Plato was living. Plato does make certain allusions to Egypt, but there's no point at which he really emphasizes any kind of connection to Judea. Nevertheless, this is a contentious issue, and one of the other questions of interaction that gets kicked up and who influenced whom in antiquity. And there's a lot of pride involved here because people want to say that they started things or that they were the ones who were important. And whichever person you like or group that you like or thing that you're most attracted to, whoever you think is the best version of it, you tend to want to say that they were first. But they may not have been first. It's hard to say for sure. Anyway, in the Timaeus, the story is that the Demiurge, the craftsman god, wants to bring the good into being. So the Demiurge tries to think about what it would mean for the good to come into being and makes the world on the basis of this. Now, the Demiurge is in some ways restricted in the Demiurge's ability to pull this off. Why is the Demiurge restricted? There are a couple of different views of the Timaeus with regard to this question. One is perhaps the forms are not entirely known to the Demiurge. Perhaps the forms exist at a level that even the Demiurge cannot directly access. If the gods do not fully understand the forms, then there will be a gap between the gods' understanding and what the gods make. Another option is that even though the forms exist in the mind of the Demiurge, nonetheless, when the Demiurge tries to make the world, the Demiurge finds that the receptacle, the kind of medium in which the world is made, has certain limiting qualities to it, that it does not permit the Demiurge to fully bring the universe into the good into being. Now, there are questions about the Timaeus. Is this story literally what Plato thinks actually happened, or is this a story? There are points in the Timaeus where it's suggested it could just be a good story that might teach you something true that doesn't have to be understood as literally what happened. But there are some people who read the Timaeus as actually a literal account, or who read it as, because it parallels certain religious accounts, as in some way indicating possibly the validity of a creation narrative in Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. So there's a lot of questions about that, right? But notice how the mimesis, the imitation, works here. The Demiurge makes the world, but the Demiurge can't quite make the world in a way which completely accords with the one or with the good. And this is the sense in which, for Plato, even the gods are limited, because there's more than one of them, for one. And then for two, the gods bring things into being. They craft. So if you bring things into being, if you craft, then you make things that are lower than yourself. You necessarily go down this ladder, right? And this is the sense in which an artistic depiction, the shadows on the wall, if you go into the allegory of the cave, right? The shadows are a kind of artistic depiction of the actual little puppets, right? And the little puppets are themselves a depiction of things which exist outside the cave. So you have these levels of being, and each time somebody makes or interprets, you come down a level and you get further removed from where you began, right? If someone makes a puppet, the puppet doesn't quite look like what's outside the cave. If somebody then uses the puppet to make a shadow, the shadow is further deviant on that basis, right? And so in this sense, for Plato, you get further and further removed from the one as you imitate it more times. Now, you imitate it because you want the one to come into being, because you want the good to come into existence, because you want the city to be good, and you want Socrates to exist, and you want him to not be killed, and you want it to be good. You do. So you try, you make things, right? But every time you try, it doesn't quite work out. Every time you try, it doesn't quite work out. And you never quite get exactly what you want. Nevertheless, for Plato, this is the most good that we can have, is to create these moments where we have cities that are decent, where we have institutions that are decent, even though they are always fated to go through some kind of regression and to have to be remade at some subsequent point.